Welcome to Rare Books Virtual Style. When the library reopens, I encourage you to look at the books I talked to you about today in person, but by visiting the Special Collections Reference and Reading Rooms on Level 4 of the Marriott Library. I hope your visit can come soon. In the meantime, I'll remind you of some other virtual options for exploring our collections. Our website takes you to our blog, Open Book, and our digital exhibitions, and my email address, should you have any questions, especially regarding the rare book collections. Today, without benefit of holding books in our hands, I'm going to introduce you to artist books celebrating the Spanish language and Hispanic or Latinx and Chicanx culture. To begin with, it's important to pay attention to the bibliographic information of a book, the who, what, when, and where, who is the author, what is the title of the book, when was the book published, where was it published. With that basic information, which you will find on a slide for each book, I want you to consider the why of each book. Why was the book written? And who was the intended audience? And finally, the how of books. The process of creating books is complicated and full of technical and technological savvy on the part of the bookmaker. The books we are going to consider today take the process of creating books to some interesting, if not startling, levels, and reward us with the final question, what is a book? Here are some questions you might want to consider as I introduce these books. How does cover art enhance the text within a book? How might the creators of books make choices about type? How do typefaces influence our reading of a text? How does page layout direct or influence our reading of a text? How do illustrations add information to text? How do images create deeper readings, or do they? Okay, let's look at some books. If you were able to hold this book, you would see that it is a very slim volume, so nearly ephemeral that we refer to it as a pamphlet, a little book with a short but big message, quickly printed on inexpensive paper to hand out to the masses. It is a pamphlet not without danger associated with it. Writing it was dangerous, printing it was dangerous, owning a copy of it was dangerous. Written by Pablo Neruda, someone we recognize today for his extraordinary poetry, this little piece of writing might have been forgotten, discarded with trash, had the message not meant so much to the owner. Ephemeral or not, the pamphlet and its survival tell us much about the time in which it was created. What I want to focus on for our purposes today, however, is the cover art. For a throwaway pamphlet, the cover is illustrated with art that commands the eye even before we read the title or notice who the author is. And then there is the manner in which the title and author are displayed. The primitive poster-like typeface is set not quite square with the page. Consider, too, the colors. Basic black and red, colors traditional to the book dating back thousands of years and used ever since. But the added tan suggests the color of flesh. All in all, a stunning opening to a stunning political diatribe. Fast forward 20 years to a very different time and country. This book, if we could hold it, would tell us a different story than the last, if only because of its size. This is a big book, long and narrow. Its pages or spreads are not bound together. The paper is downright luxurious, especially in comparison to our little pamphlet of protest. This book was intended as a work of art. Not just a book of art, but a work of art. The artist, Antonio Frasconi, was celebrated in his day and still today in ours, as an artist of great regard. His work, and much of his work is books, is actively collected by private collectors of some renown. This collection of 19 poems, including one by Pablo Neruda, is illustrated with woodcuts, one each opposite each poem. The poems themselves are letterpress printed, in other words, printed by hand. The impression that printing by hand makes on a page is noticeable. We see the letters as 3D, pushed into the paper with force. The paper takes that impression and hangs on to it. There is nothing ephemeral about this book. This is not a book that was meant to be read and then thrown away. Still, we find some interesting artistic decisions that echo the design decisions made for the cover of the Neruda pamphlet, the deliberate unleveling of the woodcuts, the deliberate unleveling of the text block, the very interesting type, all caps, and looking almost more like handwriting than print. This is not at all what we expect when we read from a book. Note, too, the inconsistency of the inking, particularly in the poetry. Was that deliberate? In this instance, it looks like part of the aesthetic. This book, Siete Poemas Sajones by Jorge Luis Borges, is also hand-printed, with very deliberate decisions made on the choice of paper, the typeface, and the decorations. Not to mention the cover or binding of the book. If you could hold this, you would feel the suede-like cloth and the puncture of the raised brass elements. We know that the bookmaker, as well as the author, is telling us something not only textually, but materially. There are similarities between this book's presentation of Borges's poetry and the presentation of the poets in the Frasconi production. A similar paper that takes the weight of the ink and holds on to it, the large size of the pages, and the nearly overwhelming white space. Illustrations, they are there, but placed much more subtly, elegantly perhaps, than those in the Frasconi book. These little abstractions taken from the plates on the cover are embossed, that is, raised on the page. We have two very different printing techniques going on here, impression and expression, so to speak, and plenty of room to rest our eyes on the poems. The process, letterpress, is the same for this book as for the Frasconi, but this printer took a much lighter approach. The ink practically kisses instead of bites the page. Same process, very different styles of presentation. This book was produced by the same man who printed the Borges production we just looked at. In both cases, the bookmaker, Gabriel Rummans, worked closely with the authors and the artists. These works are collaborations of text and image, a process that creates a very different reading of the same text than we would have in another book or online, for instance. Here, the author has taken various pieces of text found on various other printed materials and created a new text. The title page spread, much like the cover of the Neruda pamphlet, sends a clear message that we are in for something rather uncomfortable. In this book, EXCAVADOR, image overtakes text. Image includes added pieces like this receipt, which can be read, but what does it, in its obscurity as a form, add to the narrative? The author-bookmaker asks us to intensify our reading acuity. The books we've been looking at are, in the case of the Frasconi and the Rummans, referred to in the book world as fine press. That is, a careful consideration of all that goes into making the book, from the processes of letterpress printing, etching, embossing, and the choice of typefaces. With the last book, and with this one, Codex Hispanic, we are entering the world of book arts, or artist books. Like any term, people struggle with what these terms signify. In fine press and artist books, the processes, the material, the workmanship of the creator, and the text are taken all as part of a whole. These books usually contain a colophon, a paragraph at the back of the book telling the reader exactly what the processes were that went into the making of the book and what the materials were. Here, you can read what is in the colophon. It tells you who designed and printed the book, how it was printed, on what kind of paper, the format of the book, its length, and more. When we say book, we might still, even in this day and age, make an assumption: loose leaves bound together on one side and covered with something protective. Utilitarian, to be sure, even if the cover has art. But books have and do come in all sorts of forms. Book artists take historical and ethnographical forms and use them to add yet another element to our reading of text. In this case, the book is in an accordion form, a form used in Mesoamerican manuscripts. The accordion form allows the reader to turn from one page or spread to another, much like we would with a regular book, or to stretch the book out to lengths that, frankly, most of us would not have room to accommodate. In this case, the accordion format, not to mention the paper, amat, a material used by early Aztec bookmakers, reference very deliberately the culture which the text uses as one of its reference points. Each spread tells a complicated story. Like EXCAVADOR, image and text merge, twist, and scatter all over the page. The visual elements include the text. While our eye may go to the astonishing collage of imagery, Minnie Mouse greeting an Aztec god, while superheroes hover overhead like the putti and cherubim in European medieval manuscripts, the text, at least in this spread, is center. And while our eye may tell us this is going to be difficult to read, the spread, the layout, tells us that we should, in fact, that we must. We know it will not be easy to read this text. It's not easy to read the imagery. The narrative is complicated and complex. This is the clash of cultures, violent and difficult to digest on even just one spread of a book that is 30 feet long. This book, in its textual transmission of despair and dismay, calls for new definitions of how to read a book, and the way is not easy. Mickey is looking seriously stressed. Here is a textual and visual representation of distortion. But there is this book, a downright throwback to the good old days, when poems were poems, and text was text, and a book was a book. Clear typography, mellow paper, logical layout, but spiral bound. Another decision made by the bookmaker. If we could hold this book in our hands, we might be able to make some sense out of this. Was it a decision based on economics or something else? If we could hold this book in our hands, we could see that the shape of this book is square, not rectangular, the way that last book and most books are. The handmade paper is very fine, very soft. The decal, that little ruffle we can just barely make out at the edge of the page, is a pleasing reminder that our fingers read just as much as our eyes do. The bookmaker has chosen to present this poet's poems in two languages, Spanish and Hebrew, and to break up the two languages with a small but evocative figure, text and image, side by side. On the other hand, this book also contains full-page woodcuts, breaking our reading of the poems even further with imagery that could stand alone, but also extend our reading of the poetry. With this publication, a set of 2 books nested together in a box, the artist used a standard Western book format. In some ways, the production, especially compared to Codex Hispanic, looks downright normal. But just like Codex Hispanic, the artists make very specific references to 2 cultures, in this case long isolated from each other due to political borders. Here, the cover of the book, in its colors and its imagery, reference the lid of a cigar box. This book is illustrated with photographs, a different storytelling strategy than the woodcuts, embossings, etchings, and linocuts that we have just seen. Of all the illustration processes we have encountered, photography is the newest and sends a rather modern message of current sensibilities within a narrative of juxtaposed contemporary cultures laced with the pasts that created them. Here is another collaboration between American bookmakers and Cuban bookmakers. You may have noticed that nearly all of the books we have looked at are centered around poetry, perhaps the most elusive of narrative tropes. Book artists are drawn to poetry, I think, because of its emotive quality. Poetry stretches the use of language, imagery, and our imagination. Artist book pushed the limits of book structure and production in the same way that poetry pushes our acceptance of storytelling as a way to elicit more than an understanding of fact or even of fiction. In the case of this particular production, the use of 2 different types of paper reveals yet another way to read. Even from a slide, we see the differences in texture between the 2 papers and get the sense that if only we could touch these papers, we might understand the text in a way we simply could not reading virtually. One paper is handmade, but using a European method. The other paper, the paper with the image, is also handmade, but using an ancient Mesoamerican method. This paper is made from fig bark. The Nahuatl word for it is amat. Consider all the things that are going on in this spread. 2 languages, plenty of white space, the deckled edge, the large sprawl of the lizard next to the neatness of the letterpress. The lizard could easily move from chewing on its own tail to eating the type just across the gutter of the spread. I have mentioned paper and what it can tell us very briefly because paper is so difficult to read without touching, even if we can see it. Here is a book that uses paper, in this case a very clear paper, to develop and explore the narrative. The hint here is intriguing. The bookmaker takes 2 different translations of a text by Borges and maps the differences. What we discover with this project is the agenda in translation, or, as the bookmaker writes, difficulties inherent to translation, revealing a body of discrepancies. Borges wrote of a mythical labyrinth. The bookmaker created a typographic labyrinth. About this book, the bookmaker writes, a central theme conveyed in the title of the story is the notion that one might imagine a multiplicity of personal existences, each of which expresses a choice made in life that initiated a sequence of events and a particular existence, parallel but unique realities. Such paradoxical anti-parallels are mirrored in the text-based works of my projects, particularly this book, which represents a line-by-line analysis of two translations in their entirety. It is at the same time a concrete poem, conveying concepts embedded in the text through its own typographic form of two parallel lines of text that are paradoxically equal and not equal simultaneously. I believe this conversation alludes to the impossibility of seeing the true nature of our predicament for want of a view of the total territory we occupy. The bookmaker continues. Anti-parallel searches for connections between the paths we follow through living that offer continuous choices. It explores how paths not taken may linger in the mind and develop into persistent fantasies, ruminations, or narratives of desire and conquest. It suggests that dreams are constructed from the vapors of roads not taken. What are we to think when the bookmaker has as much to say about the textual and visual aspects of his book as the author has to say in the original text? What does it mean to pull apart a narrative, textually and typographically? How accurate is literary or artistic analysis? In this book, the bookmaker is the author. She analyzes concepts pared down to single words illustrated with abstract visuals. Buscar, to search. Esperar, to wait. Resolver, to solve problems. And querer, to want. I'll end with Doc Undoc, a book of multiple components emanating from a talking box and including sound on CD and video on DVD. The added multimedia concepts seem contemporary. This book was produced in 2014, but already in 2020, CD and DVD are old technologies. Doc Undoc, described as a sequel to Codex Hispaniensis, is the creation of the same author, Guillermo Gómez Peña, the same bookmaker, Felicia Rice, and several other artists. The book's theme is expressed here by Gómez Peña, an open text, both in the sense that it's only partially scripted and structured, and in the sense that it opens many doors within my psyche and between my psyche and the social world. The author and the artist invite the reader to explore their own psyches within this social world by actively participating in, as opposed to with, this book, or, as Gómez Peña alternately calls it, traveling case, or border kit, or toolbox, or curiosity cabinet, or altar. The box includes multiple ephemeral pieces, objects, each of which do tell its own story. The pieces sit in compartments lined in brightly colored satin, a shiny material that suggests luxury. What might a different choice in color and material have suggested? Readers are invited to engage with the objects, producing a very personal reading. Text and evocative imagery printed on background colors that match the satin linings in the box compete for the reader's attention. The box includes a mirror inside the top in which the reader is confronted with herself. Buttons within the compartments can be pushed, invoking the author's voice as a disembodied, ghostly background noise. In this way, the author leads the reader through the compartments or chapters, objects, paragraphs of the theme: isolation, identity, and individuality. We began with a list of questions. Here is one more. When does a book stop being a book and become something else entirely? Thank you for being with me. I hope that you will visit us again soon to see the books or to explore books in other of our PowerPoint presentations.